Dog Training Digital presents the Ecollars podcast with Robin McFarland and Steve Snell.
Yeah, we got an interesting topic today, Steve. This is one that I really like to dig into. When I teach my program for dog trainers, it became very apparent to me that a lot of people just flat out don't know the history of remote collars. I think it's taken for granted a little bit. They've been around and really popular probably for the last 10 years, but I don't think a lot of people know what existed and what was before that. So I know that your background is far more extensive than mine in terms of knowing how far back this goes. So if you're interested, you want to chat a little bit and take us down that path?
Hey, I remember, as far as we're talking about my experience with them, first one I remember was like the early 1980s. My dad had one of the gold units that Tritronics was making, the giant tubes with the long antennas, and they were...
we're talking about...
Yeah, we're talking about this.
Yes. Antique?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And so my dad had, I guess it was an A1, I think it was an A170, and I was not allowed to touch it. It stayed in a spot in the house, and when we used it in the field, I was not allowed to touch it. But now I was 10 at the time, so I really had no reason to. Now, there were some models of collars that were out in the 50s that I'm not very familiar with. Tritronics, there were several models that were out. Tritronics got their start in the late 60s. But, like I said, my experience is more from 1980 to present. And let's talk a little bit. There was not a lot, in my opinion, there was not a lot going on as far as training with collars. They were more aversion devices back then. And that's really where they came from. They were designed to stop animals from doing things. And they were pretty blunt instruments as far as what my experience with them was. They were not very reliable. They had a lot of interference issues, and stimulation on them was pretty strong. And how you increased levels was even a problem. Like the gold unit that you had there, what is that? Is that an A180?
Yeah, that's A180.
Okay.
Yeah.
So those units, depending on how old they were, either had A level, or there was back in the day where we used to have plugs, and you would increase levels by taking a plug out and putting another plug in. So you would have one level at a time. And then they went to contact points, where you had a different color contact point, and you would change the contact point out. You were just incredibly limited as what you could do with them compared to what we have today.
And that's
very different.
That's my understanding. And this is what I've been telling my students is, when they came out, we're talking about the necessity simply was to stop an animal from they came from the hunting world. This is my knowledge, and correct me, jump in here if I'm wrong. But they came from the hunting world, and
yeah, they did. And like Tritronics was out in Arizona, and the guys that were using the devices out there were chasing mountain lions. Which you've never seen that. I have not personally done that. I know some guys that do it, and that was where the primary focus was. They were hunting mountain lions with hounds.
Wow,
which is pretty
tough stuff. And so when we think about that, right? We think about the reality that this dog is going to be hundreds of yards in front of you. There's no way you're going to have a check cord on a dog that's that long. And your main focus is stopping the dog when you need to, right? That's the number one focus. So a high level aversive, if the dog was going to go off course, or the dog's going to get himself in trouble, the necessity for a high level aversive to stop him. So that was what started the invention of this equipment, if you will. And the way I explain it to people is, basically, they had one or two buttons on them. If they had two, one button was, I am talking to you, and the other button was Shazam. And thus the name shock collar, which probably was very well deserved.
It was incredibly appropriate at the time.
It was appropriate. And so that sounds horrible to a person nowadays. And we have people that don't understand remote collars at all. So we get caught in this lingo of shock collar. But I think what people don't understand is prior to technology, we're talking about some techniques that were dangerous to the dog. We're talking about buckshot.
Sure.
I've talked to a lot of old retriever folks. We're talking about buckshot. We're talking about being out there with trip lines, setting the dog up to learn his lesson, to go hindquarters over front quarters. He's going to go tumbling with a check line. So there had to be ways to teach consequence. So when this technology came out and you had Shazam, that was actually an improvement in humaneness in comparison.
Let me correct you just slightly there. Buckshot would not be buckshot. It would be more like bird shot or rat shot. Yeah. And that's, just a slight difference there, but we're still, and people find this very hard to believe, but that was how some trainers, I have never been involved with it, but I know some guys, old timers from way back, that at a certain distance, that's what they're doing. And it's beyond inhumane, but it was the option that they had at the time. And some people are not going to be okay with that justification, but it's more of there's always been a problem dealing with a dog that is a long distance away from you. And this was a technique that allowed a certain kind of communication. Now, it was pretty brutal.
Gosh.
And you had to have a certain kind of dog that could handle.
Yeah.
So, and we didn't see, in my opinion, a lot of advancement in that really up until the late 90s. Tritronics had products that you still had the plugs, and then you went to the contact points, which, I started selling Tritronics in the late 90s. As far as as a company, we've been selling them before that, but I came back into the company in 98. And I was using DT Systems collars, and DT Systems actually I still have it. It's called the DT 500. It was one of the first collars that I ever used that it didn't have a dial on it, but it had a flip switch. And so it was a 6-level collar, and you had a lower button that was level 1, a button above that was level 2, and then you had press 2 buttons together for level 3, and then you hit the switch, and it was 4, 5, 6. And you could do some stuff with it. Now, it was more like a collar today. It was more like a Pro 70 that Garmin has, in that it was a 6-level collar. And it wasn't quite as subtle as most of what we have. But at that time, Tritronics was still using the contact points, where you'd have 6 different color contact points, and
a
brown was one, and we were talking about it. You've got one there.
Actually, I think I went here. The sportsman collar that had.
Yeah.
So you changed intensity by.
Exactly.
By changing. So you had to have a hold of the dog, and you had to change intensity here. You had very limited option at the transmitter. Yeah.
So you would put, and it was even confusing for people because the color scheme, and off the top of my head, I don't know it anymore, but like I know light blue was a 1/2 and brown was a 1. And like the orange and red were like 2 and 3. And I think yellow was 4 and a green was 5, which people struggled with that because it didn't make sense that green would be the highest color, some sort of engineering increase. And so it was one of those things that didn't necessarily it made sense to an engineer, but it didn't make sense to a consumer, because it's weird that red would be the strongest and green would be the lightest. But it was a problem in that you had to remove the collar from the dog to change out the intensity level. And when people think about that nowadays, where we have collars that they've got 160 stimulation levels, and you have a dial, or you have 21 levels, and it's a 1, 2, 3, and you turn your dial, it's 4, 5, 6, and you can drastically change stimulation and dial it into what that dog needs in a moment. We didn't have that back then. That sportsman collar, it was a 1 level. You had to change the level at the collar, and it was revolutionary at the time. And this is the late 90s. Now, did you ever use Initech stuff?
I did not use the Initech stuff. Yep. And what I actually did is I had a pro level unit from Tritronics, which had more versatility at the transmitter, but I wasn't going to be able to have my pet clients commit $500-$600 to get a pet level or a pro level collar. So I generally, for what I did, I conditioned dogs on the pro collar. I did all the work, and then kind of figured out what would be the comparison plug to put on that sportsman collar.
Sure.
Sent the dogs home with that. So that made it an easier process.
Sure. So the collar that you were using still had the plugs, but it had a low, medium, and high. Yours was working? Are you when they had it? Did you have it?
They had it on the dial. You could go low. You could turn the dial between whatever. I think it was 1 to 8, and you had a low, medium, with those 8.
Yeah. All right. So that's early 2000s.
Yeah.
And Initech, around that same time, Initech they'd come into the market, and basically we had some competition that came in. And at that time we had Tritronics, we had DT Systems, and then we had Initech. And Initech was one of the first companies that gave us a lot of stimulation options as far as being able to change stimulation at the transmitter. Like I said, we had a few things with DT systems and we had a few things with Initech. We didn't have as much with Tritronics, in my opinion, got kind of dragged kicking and screaming into. They were not terribly interested. And this is my take on it, which some of the guys that are around, and I know a few of them, might disagree with me, but they were not in a big hurry. They controlled the market and they were doing really well. And they were not in a giant hurry to change. And some of these smaller companies, which is why competition is always good, I think, kind of forced their hand. And that's where we got stimulation where you could change the stimulation at the transmitter. And we kind of moved into what I consider to be the modern era of Ecollars. And around that time is when Dogtra came into the market. And Dogtra kind of changed the game. I clearly remember when we first started looking at Dogtra collars because it was such a different concept in that they were using rheostat dials and they had a much wider choice of stimulation from what we had seen before that, which I think you were early on with Dogtra as far as using their products.
2002, 2003, somewhere around there. And once I saw their product, I really jumped over that direction. The rheostat was kind of a game changer because I personally was not pre-training the dog. So I wasn't teaching all of the behaviors and then adding an e-collar to it, right? So I wanted to be able to actually teach with the e-collar, which meant I needed really subtle levels in order to do that. So when I got to play with the rheostat system, that made it a real easy jump for me. And I think if people don't understand the difference between a clickable dial and a rheostat, and when you said there was a lot more levels, that didn't mean there was more intensity. It meant that they essentially take the same range of intensity, whatever that's going to be from low until high, and you split it into pieces. And so if one company's splitting it into pieces of 8, then you're going to have jumps between that. If one company's splitting that into 24 pieces because they have a low and a medium and a high of those 8, now you got 24 in that range, but you still have a gap. So when Dogtra came out or the rheostat systems came out, suddenly you're going to take that same range and you're going to split it into 120 or 125 or 127, I think is what it is now. So now your gap between those levels is so minimal. You just have less risk, for lack of a better word right now, of a dog startling because you can go up in a different way. It's like using a dial on a radio. If you dial your radio and you're looking at the digital readout and it says you're on a 10 and you go to 11, it's so subtle you can't tell the difference, right? So very similar thought process.
My brother has used trying to a good way to explain it to somebody is actually a thermostat, where the difference between a thermostat that's set at 70 degrees and your next level is 80 degrees. That's one of those things where there's a huge difference between 70 and 80 in a house. And in a house at 80 degrees, if you're at 80 degrees, there's a pretty good chance you're calling the air conditioner repairman. But at 70, you might be uncomfortable. I like it a nice 68. But at 70, so it's one of those things that but you're uncomfortable at 70, but at 72, it's perfect. But at 78 or 80, it's not. And that's a good example. We still have some collars that I don't classify as training collars. I classify them as either trash breaking collars, but Garmin has a product actually called the Trash Breaker. And then we have another product called the Pro 70, which is based off of that A170 that we were talking about. So it's 70 years of history there. Okay. Well, not that old, 50 years. But
the collars are that old. You and I are not that old.
That like a Pro 70 is a 7-level collar. And so it has gaps in between. So you have a 1 and a 2 and a 3, and it's jumping higher, where a Pro 550 has 21 levels. And so it still goes as high as a 70, but it has more levels in between. And so that's where I come back to the thermostat. Now, unlike you, I was very stuck on set levels or tactile. When I'm on a 1 and I go to a 2, I want to feel that turn. And I did not go to the rheostats, and it's not my primary go-to. And it's got more to do with the fact that I spent most of my time training prior to Dogtra was a newer company, and I'm just ingrained in what I was doing. And so, but I did find, and especially after I started working with you, I found some of the subtleties that were there that is harder to do, because there's a point in there where you have so many levels what's the difference on a Dogtra between a 45 and a 46?
Right.
But there's a difference between a 45 and a 49.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things that it allows you to be really subtle with a dog and to really dial in and find the stimulation level.
Yeah.
So, and dog collars have kind of they've gone to a lot of different, some of their units still have rheostats but a lot of their units have LCD screens on them. So you can see, and a lot of guys, and I think you're this way, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you do a lot of your rheostat stuff by feel. You're not,
yeah.
You're not necessarily looking at that screen
no. And honestly, the screen, I get it. I get that is meant for the consumer. I really try to teach people, don't look at it. Don't look at it. I've actually had a few people where I will tape over it with electrical tape because I need to teach them to watch. The dog tells you what you need to know. Right. And back to your brother's explanation about the thermostat, which I'm stealing, by the way. Brilliant.
Yes.
Brilliant. So you're comfortable at 68. I am the 78 girl. Quite honestly, I like it on the warm side. Give me the 78. I'm very comfortable with that temperature. And that's why you have to be able to, the number doesn't tell you anything. It gives you a reference point that makes you comfortable. Once you know your dog, you're like, oh yeah, it usually works around this level. So you can read that out on your LCD screen or even with a clickable dial. But regardless which piece of equipment a person has a preference for, your eyes are on the dog when you're figuring out, is this a level that is influencing behavior or not? And if you're not influencing behavior, you're not doing any good. And if you're overwhelming the dog, you're not doing any good there either. So we kind of went through the history there and got to because nowadays we have, so early 2000s, we started seeing units that allowed us to increase stimulation in several different ways. Initech had buttons where you could program your buttons. Tritronics had dials. DT Systems had dials that were, some of DTs were clickable and some of them were rheostat. Dogtra had rheostat, in the majority of their stuff. We started seeing some more digital units. DT Systems had some stuff that went heavily to a screen. Initech had some stuff that went heavily to a screen. Sport Dog showed up sometime early mid 2000s. Their stuff was dials and buttons. And we have had a lot of different products, and there's a lot of products on the market now today where you can sort of find what you're looking for. If you prefer a tactile dial, great. We've got a lot of different stuff that has that. If you prefer a rheostat, Dogtra has a large number of rheostat devices, and anything that has LCD screens, it doesn't. They have a couple of different power levels. I've had a conversation in the past, and this is something that people struggle with a little bit because there is not a consistent numerical system that goes across the industry. Where a 7 on a Garmin, and for those that are not up with the history, Garmin bought out Tritronics in, I don't know, the last 10 years. So nowadays, when we're talking about Tritronics, you'll occasionally hear Garmin Tritronics or you'll just hear Garmin. But there's not a consistent numerical system that goes across the board. So sometimes for people, when they're looking at Dogtra, there's 127 levels on a Dogtra and they're comparing it to a Garmin unit that has 21. Mm-hmm. And it's not that this is 1 through 21 and then the Dogtra picks up at 22 and goes to 127. Right. That's not how it works. And there's even, I think you can, if you take the two units and you can measure the electrical stimulation and you could do it by feel. I have had people that have been with one brand collar and they're like, well, this dog's on a 3, and they go to another brand and a 3, because a 3 on a Garmin compared to a 3 on a Dogtra they're not the same thing. No. And even the stimulation's not the same. I mean, everybody patents technology. And I think that's super important for if somebody's going to switch companies, you got to you don't have to completely start over, obviously, but you got to recondition your dog to that sensation because it's going to feel a little bit different.
Yeah. So, and this is one of those things that if people haven't felt stimulation, they won't, and we'll talk about it where we'll go, well, this stimulation feels a little bit sharper, or this one's a little dull. Some of the stimulation feels flat or it pulses. And so it is one of those things that you're going to get different reactions depending on what it is. I don't necessarily think one's necessarily better or worse. I think it's one of those things that a lot of it depends on what you're used to or what you're looking for. And that's not really a right or wrong answer. That's more of a,
I just wanted to jump in there. When people think there's better or worse or there's right or wrong, you got to remember that's putting our human emotion on it. Because the reality is the dog has no preconceived notion. He doesn't know what this is. This is just a sensation. You're starting at the bottom with any collar when you're conditioning. You're figuring out what sensation influences behavior and you're creating an association with it. So the dog has no preconceived notion. Oh my gosh, this is electricity. Oh my gosh, this is sharper, duller. He doesn't know. It's a matter of the user getting knowledge about how to use this thing. But so anyway, I just want to jump into that. But
well, and so that kind of covers most of and like I said, nowadays we have a lot of different collars, and it's a little overwhelming for a lot of people, to be totally honest with you, as far as what's out there.
Let me just show this for comparison. If we want to talk about, so we've been talking obviously a lot about the transmitters. We've been talking about the stimulation, the advances, the collar size, right? So this was that A180. This was that gold tooth. Okay. This is my little Loki, my little terrier's collar. And my understanding is this receiver weighs 1.5 ounces. Okay. Now, this is a little guy collar, right? This is more typical of what I'm going to put on a lot of dogs. This is 3.5 ounces. I use my Garmin quite a bit too. Garmin collar, the thing looks bulkier, but it's actually very lightweight, pretty slim. The advancements are back to this. If you wanted a dog to stay and he weighed less than probably 35 pounds, all you got to do is put it on. Yeah, he ain't going anywhere.
Those were not designed for your teacup poodle.
No.
We weren't using those on Chihuahua. And actually, I mean, I remember when we started to get to the collars that were substantially smaller, and we'd have customers call in and they're looking for something for this size dog. And for a long time, we just didn't have and we even had some collars that the contact points were so far apart that they wouldn't touch a dog. The dog could put his neck in between the two contact points. Yeah. And they're coming up on the sides, and they think the product's not working, and it's working fine. It's just the dog's not feeling it.
Yep.
So the technology has drastically changed over time, where we have collars now. I personally don't run into a dog that I cannot use stimulation on. I may have some dogs that never get above a 1, 2, or 3 on a collar. For a dog collar, for me, it's going to be 10, 15, 20, somewhere in that neighborhood, where on a Garmin, it might be a 1, 2, or a 3. But we just don't find if you're using the right collar. And then we still have a couple of collars that we sell that we generally don't consider to be training collars. They're more trash breaking or problem. I hate to say problem solving collars, but they're designed to they're not as subtle as I would like for them to be. But let's talk about how the training techniques actually, where they originated and how they changed.
And so again, jump in here if I'm incorrect, but from the studying that I've done, I think it's fair to say one of the first people, to my awareness, that really got out there and started talking about this, started teaching workshops, was Rex Carr. I think Rex Carr is generally considered the father of remote collar training in terms of educating people. He was in the retriever world, is my understanding. Actually, I think I still have a video that I may have gotten from Gun Dog Supply that was like one of his last workshops, which was really fascinating for me to watch, because even watching it in comparison to what I do now, yes, are things different because technology is different than what it was in the late 80s, early 90s? Yeah, things are different, but not that vastly different. We need to give credit to the concept that because technology had started to advance considerably by then, they weren't just stopping a dog from running trash, right? They were starting to use some indirect pressure. They were starting to be able to teach a dog, for instance, to whistle sit. So if you're getting off course, rather than blasting you for getting off course because you want to chase something, I'm going to teach you with pressure to sit and stop and look at me, and now I can cast you and I can redirect. Well, that in and of itself was revolutionary in my thought process, and what we're doing today in today's world is because we are teaching behavior. That was kind of the beginning of let's teach a dog what to do rather than simply use a collar for stop doing. And from that, then Jim and Phylis Dodds got working with Tritronics. They did the book, they did the videos. Alice Woodyard, who, how blessed was I? I actually I had Alice's number years back and got to chat with her a few times. I mean, talk about having good influence on your career, right? And then because I started moving into some of the working dog arena, military police dogs, that kind of stuff, Brian Mowry came out with some stuff. It was my understanding that he worked with the Dobbs, and that's how he learned some of it. So he started showing, how do you bring these things into that working community? I think, if I remember correctly, his video was out for patrol and detector dogs. So I started taking a look at that because I thought, well, gosh, how many pet owners are going to struggle with getting the dog to drop a sock, stuff like that. So all of these folks that deserve credit because the technology advanced and it was no longer just a stopping mechanism. It was actually a to-do mechanism. They started putting the work out there. They started preaching what could be done and the possibility. And now here we are, 2022, and we have technology that's even more refined. And I can be doing, for me personally in the pet world, I can be doing the same really cool stuff even more subtly with a dachshund, with a terrier, with the golden doodle. Everybody's dog is capable of this because of the technology. So as much as sometimes I hear as a professional trainer, sometimes we're like, oh, we wish the batteries would last longer. We wish this, we wish that. We don't realize sometimes till you take a look back how far we've come and how blessed we are with the technology. And I would say, like every other technology in our world, is going to keep getting better.
We've experienced some of that. I spend a lot of time with GPS collars now. And that's where Garmin got into the remote training collar world, where they were doing GPS-based dog tracking collars. And everybody wanted a system that was together. And that's where the purchase from Drytronics came in. So they took those two companies and they were looking to do an e-collar GPS combo, and they bought Drytronics to do that. But we had to back up in a lot of technology, or we stepped backwards in a lot of things during that process because we had gotten to where battery life was substantially longer and we didn't have external antennas. Everything was internal, but yet we had greater distances. If you go back and look at that, you got that A170 collar?
Yeah. You want the transmitter or the collar?
No, look at the collar. This is something that a lot of folks it'll trip them out a little bit. Look at the strap. If it's what I think it is, yes. Okay. So that white wire that's in the collar strap, that's the antenna.
Oh, I did not know that.
Well, I don't have it with me, but I have one that it has this little plastic triangle on it. And so it was designed so that it would, when you put the collar on the dog, so this is the collar and you have this loose extra strap hanging down. It had this little triangle right here, so it would kick up. And so it would elevate the strap, which had the antenna woven into it. Okay. Now take that back. So we'd gotten to where that was not a thing. The last external antennas that we had were late 90s for early 2000. We had some Initech stuff that had external antennas. And if you wanted more range, it had an external antenna. Well, go to 2007. And they're doing GPS collars, and the GPS collars work off of a different frequency. And now we have external antennas. So you're buying stuff in the mid 2000s that now has an external antenna. And it had been 7 to 10 years since I'd had a collar that had an external antenna on it. And to make matters worse, because it's GPS, it's pulling the signal in, it's processing information differently, and it's pulling satellite information in and then the collars then sending that information back to the handheld. So unlike a remote training collar, which a remote training collar is a receiver, a GPS collar is a transmitter and a receiver. And because it's sending information back to your handheld so you know where the dog is. And so next thing, we're struggling to get a full day off of a charge. And still to this day, my personal collar that I use is a Garmin Pro 550 Plus, which is different from the Pro 550, which is just an e-collar. The Pro 550 Plus is a GPS collar, and you get about 12 hours of runtime off of on the transmitter, which is a hard thing for a lot of people to adjust to. And back in the day, that was it. You run during the day, and if you were lucky, you got a full day off charge, and at night you charge it up to use it the next day. Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but most transmitters nowadays will go weeks, even with heavy use.
Yeah, they do.
You can go weeks without it. Collar generally takes a little bit more, but the transmitters are only using electricity when you're pressing buttons. So, but a GPS transmitter is using energy constantly. So a 550 Plus transmitter, you're not going to get your 12 hours, maybe 15, depending on if you control the backlight. So it's one of those things where I have to charge my gear every night now. And so I feel like it's 1995 and I have to charge my stuff. Yeah. So the technology has changed a good bit. Going back, and my history with Mr. Carr is not as good as it probably should be. I have more history with the people that trained under him, which the Dobbs would be one of them, Evan Graham, several others. But the Dobbs to me were probably one of the most influential because unlike a lot of trainers, they covered an enormous amount of disciplines.
Yep.
They brought stuff. Rex Carr was primarily a retriever guy. As far as I know, he was only a retriever guy. He may have had some military background. I'm not positive about that. I actually know a couple of guys that have worked with him that are still around, so we probably should. But to me, the Dobbs were incredibly influential from a training standpoint in the hunting side of it and in the working dog side of it, in the, I would say, military police dog side of it. I know that's where the vast majority of their work was done in those fields. And it's kind of spread out from there. We don't have as much. There's a lot more today than there ever has been. But, when you get out into the strictly obedience, there's a lot more of it now. And there's a lot of folks that are doing stuff now. But a lot of that has to do with the technology.
Yep.
For me, it was bird dogs. I saw it in Rick Smith is who showed me his bird dog training. And the Smiths when Initech came around, they were using collars before that. But when Initech developed stuff, they worked with Initech from the standpoint of you had a real subtle rise in your stimulation where you could gradually increase it. And they were able to change the way they were training bird dogs. And so that's where my background in it primarily comes from. But there's probably not a good history. And I think you're completely right. It's funny. This is one of those things that if you haven't been involved in the industry, you might not even be aware of the history of it and where we are. And there probably should be more covered on that.
It's something that I feel kind of passionate about. I think being aware of it helps us know how far we've come. It can help us dream about the future, certainly. But I think I just feel that it's so important to always give credit to people that broke through some of those barriers for us, because I don't know where my career would be without having had the opportunity to educate people about this tool. So I'm thankful to what they started for us.
Well, it's definitely one of those things that people should at least be aware of where we were and where we are today.
We might go.
I talked a little bit about GPS collars. There's probably not a GPS collar in the market that if I handed it to you, you would be excited about it from the standpoint they're big and they use a lot of power and they have external antennas because they work off of it. They work off of MERS frequency, which is different from most e-collars work off of 27 megahertz. And so that's a big deal. You and I both have always kind of come from the beauty of training collars is off leash, the ability to work with a dog off leash. The majority of the time that your dogs are off leash, they're seldom out of your visual range, I would assume. The majority of the time that you and I are out and I see you run dogs, you can typically see them. That is not the case for me. Even in some of the big open country that I spend time in with my dogs, it's not uncommon for a dog to be 400 or 500 yards away from me. Yeah. Or we're in some hilly country, or we're in some stuff that's got a lot of gullies and kind of the next step for the rest of the market, I would think, because having that ability. Now, there's some stuff on the market. I don't know if you've worked with any of them. There's a lot of GPS products that are cellular based, and I don't have a lot of experience with them, but basically it's a device that's on your dog and it's using the SMS network, which is basically the way that we text. So as long as you're in the general vicinity of a cell tower, the unit's going to be able to communicate. And in a lot of places that works great. It doesn't work for what I do. And we looked at a few units. To me, the technology wasn't quite there for us to get real excited about it. The other thing about that type of technology is that you have to have a cell phone plan for your dog because it is using the text network. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there moving forward. My biggest fear moving forward is that we complicate the products beyond a training tool. You talk a good bit, and I agree with this completely in that I want a transmitter that I can operate without having to look at it. And we see a lot of touch screens now. There's a lot of opportunity for technology that you can incorporate into. Some of the companies have kind of wanted to make it more of a cell phone, smartphone type device. And you've got to be careful about that because you end up with something that doesn't work for the average consumer, or it's not fast enough where if something's happening with a dog, you need to be able to correct it and increase or lower your levels very quickly. But you need to keep your eye on the dog the entire time. And I don't know where that comes in. So I spend a good bit of my time when I'm working with manufacturers trying to keep them from taking it too far, where they just make things overly complicated.
Yeah.
So, but what do you see?
I don't know. I mean, personally, because I'm with you on a lot of these things. Simple is better, in my opinion. And the reason I say that is I'm working 99.9% of all my work is in the pet world, and people have very busy lives. They're not full-time dog trainers. Simple products, simple to understand. Some of the pieces of equipment right now, I think, are more complicated than they need to be. Not that they're bad, but when you can train, you can change to multiple modes and you can do this. I can't tell you how many people have reached out to me and said, what should I set it to? I don't know what to do. So keeping it simple, keeping it very intuitive is important to me. Certainly continuing to improve the appearance of that's meaningful to me in the pet world. Improve the appearance, improve how it fits the dog. Why do I say that? Because people get emotional about what they don't understand.
Right.
And so I don't appreciate if my clients are doing the right thing by their dogs are completely happy, their dogs have earned this off-leash freedom. And yet, if they're having a piece of equipment in their hand or they see something on a dog's neck, especially a short-coated dog, and they get attacked for it. What is that you have on your dog? Yeah. So improving those things, from my perspective, is important.
Sure.
I totally get what you're saying about the GPS. That's not part of my world because I'm generally not working with dogs that are working that far out. And as a pet trainer, I'm telling people you need to have control of your dog, and that means he's in eyesight. So, but I totally get what you're saying on that. So it's more about the appearance and simplicity for me. And reliability, I think, is exceptional, but certainly we can always improve things like that. We already have things now that are totally waterproof. That's wonderful. The range is good. Cross frequencies is almost a non-issue.
Right.
These things are like garage door openers now, right? My garage door opener doesn't open to the neighbors. So we don't have cross frequencies anymore. So we're in a good place. Yeah, don't overcomplicate it. That'd be my take.
Definitely. The GPS part, I always enjoy how you have certain issues that are really important to you. And I have, and we cross over on a lot of stuff, but the GPS thing's a big deal for me. I had a dog once that he cut a vein in his leg, across the front of his leg, crossing a barbed wire fence. And I got lucky because I was crossing the fence almost exactly where he was. And he would have died had he crossed the fence 50 yards, 100 yards away from me, because I probably wouldn't have realized it was a problem until it was too late.
Wow.
But what happened is that I had 3 dogs on the ground at the time. Well, I was going to leave 2 of them on the ground if I was going to save this dog. And so I got lucky. I got back to the truck. Everything worked out. I got back to the truck with the dog. I was able to patch him up at the truck. I got him to the vet, was able to take care of him. Everything was fine. I had 2 dogs on the ground with me. One of them was a puppy and actually just kind of stayed with me. And I was able to throw him in the truck as we were going. The other one was an older dog and she was out there. And it took me about 3 hours to get back to her. And had I not had a GPS collar, I would not have been able.
Wow.
I'm not going to say I would not have found her, but so when I go back to the GPS, it's those situations that you don't think about, especially if you spend a lot of time out. You hike a bunch with your dogs, something can happen. So
you know what? You just sparked an idea. Here's what I'd like to see for the future.
All right.
Why not some physiological metrics that we can get feedback on? Why not core temperature? Why not heart rate? We're accused at least the pet world, we're accused that this thing is really harmful to the dog. Right. There's people that are screaming abuse and things like that. Give us the data. We can wear these things on our watches. Could we get the data built in, that kind of stuff?
That is actively going on. I haven't seen anything yet that the problem with it is okay, so I'm wearing a watch right now that is able to tell you my heart rate and my physical activity and that kind of stuff. They haven't quite figured out a way to do it on a dog. Measuring core temperature on a dog, there's really only one way to do it. And they haven't figured out how to do that. That would be internally.
Right.
And they haven't exactly figured out a way to do that with something like that. But I know multiple companies are working on that. That's definitely something, because I'm the same way. I've reached a point where in my life where I don't like to get up and do my stuff without having my watch on, because I'm trying to hit certain metrics and I want to know what I did. My wife and I were out for a walk the other day and she didn't have her watch on. And she was like, I'm not going. And I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, I'm not going to get credit for it. I'm not doing it. Yeah, exactly. And we have some of that. We do have some of that with the GPS technology now, where you can actually keep up with the speed of the dog, distance travel, that kind of stuff. It's not as reliable as we would like for it to be, but it is definitely something that multiple companies are interested in and are working on. I would love to know from a heat stroke standpoint. I've had dogs that have gotten close before, and I've had dogs that have gone into, I've had a dog that I was hunting with that went into hypothermia. Yeah. And both of those conditions are one of those things that that if you're not paying attention, it's too late. A lot of times, once you realize what's going on, it's too late. And so I would love to have more of that kind of information. I don't think we're quite there yet, but there's definitely work being done on it because it is an important thing. I mean, I think that even your average pet owner wants to know what's going on and wants to have a better gauge on it. So I'm pretty excited about as far as the future of this type of technology. Like I said, my goal is to keep them from screwing it up, but I'm very interested in seeing what comes from it. Well, this was a much more fascinating topic than when you introduced this idea to me. I was like, I find it hard to believe we're going to be able to talk about this for very long.
Look at that.
Look at that. I definitely think we need to go into it a little deeper though, because like I said, this is one of those things that we're kind of getting to that stage where some of the guys that were around, some of them are already gone, and perhaps we need to dig into that a little further. Well, that was neat. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. For more information or to purchase Robin's online dog training programs, visit Ecollars.com.
This is Robin McFarland's Ecollar Training. This video series takes a systematic approach to e-collar use from introduction to off-leash control. 3 dogs of varying personalities were adopted from a shelter environment and trained daily over the course of 3 weeks. This DVD series captures the real-time footage starting from day 1 of introducing the e-collar and progresses to the point of off-leash control and working around real-world distractions. Robin takes you step by step through the process of laying a foundation, solving common problems, working through distractions, and graduating to off-leash freedom. The systematic approach and detailed instruction is designed specifically with the novice e-collar user in mind, but even experienced trainers will find a gem or two to add to the training toolbox. Each of the dogs in this video series, Grace, Brandy, and Bonnie, started training within 72 hours of being adopted from a shelter environment. What you will see is real-time training sessions, not special editing or previously trained dogs. Watch dogs with different temperaments being worked through challenges toward the goal of off-leash control and a greatly improved relationship with their handler. Robin's e-collar instructional materials are clear, concise, and never sacrifice the physical or emotional well-being of the dog. With this training, your dog will be calmer, more controlled, and be able to experience the joy of off-leash freedom. If you've longed to be able to trust your dog off-leash, but don't have the confidence to start training with an e-collar, this video series is for you. Any dog owner that is interested in learning an easier way to communicate with their dog while gaining off-leash reliability will benefit from this DVD series. This 5-disc set will take you step by step through the process from starting the training and finding a level up through working around distractions and being ready to go off-leash.